Hi, everybody. Hello. Is it not on? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Hi, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Allison Lantero. I'm the president of the Notre Dame chapter of the American Constitution Society. I'd like to thank you all for coming to our event today. As many of you will recall, Attorney General William Barr was on campus last month to give remarks of his views of religious freedom. While we respect the Attorney General's right to his own opinion, we think that it's important to provide an alternative perspective to the Attorney General's concerns about militant secularists and the loss of Judeo-Christian values. And I am very excited to introduce Professor Patricia Hackett, who will be providing our remarks. Professor Hackett is both a legal and theological scholar. Some of you may recognize her, as she is an adjunct professor at the law school, and she provided a wonderful introduction to last year's event on marriage equality. Professor Hackett is not just a double domer, but a triple domer. She received her bachelor's in government and theology, her master's in theology, and her JD cum laude, all from Notre Dame. She has been a practicing attorney for 28 years and opened her own firm in South Bend in 2006, where she focuses on estate planning, probate litigation, healthcare law, and family law. Professor Hackett was appointed to the Indiana Supreme Court Committee on Character and Fitness and is a former president of the Robert A. Grant Inn of Court, which our law school is affiliated with. Professor Hackett's interests aren't limited to the law. She not only completed her master's in theology, but also engaged in PhD studies in Catholic systematic theology at the Catholic University of America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Patricia Hackett.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here, especially with this inclement weather. It was a trip and a feat, I know, for some of us to get here, so thank you. Because what we will be discussing, I believe, is very important. And just know that my remarks are made in a spirit of certainly difference from Attorney General Barr, but deep respect for the office he holds and toward him as a person. So I've entitled my talk, Contempt of Grace, the Theological and Legal Error of William Barr's Understanding of Religious Freedom. And I am so delighted that the law school is providing the opportunity for diverse perspectives on such a matter of significant import as is religious freedom. So, as was mentioned, I'm a practicing attorney and an adjunct professor of the law school. My advanced degrees are in theology and the law, and that's the perspective from which I will speak today. On October 11th, 2019, Attorney General Barr delivered remarks he described as pertaining to, quote, religious liberty in America. Instead, the speech Mr. Barr gave was, in my assessment, an alarming apologetic for an extreme Christian nationalism as theologically ill-informed as it is dangerous to the rule of law within our constitutional republic. It is for this reason, as a theologically trained practicing attorney, I am compelled to speak with you today. As the sitting Attorney General, Mr. Barr's remarks were inconsistent with his constitutional duty to defend the religious liberty of all people, Christians and non-Christians, believers and non-believers alike. His remarks also profess to comport with Catholic Christianity. In fact, his positions are inconsistent with the theological anthropology of grace, and by grace I mean God's work and presence within creation, which is essential to Catholicism's commitment to the dignity of all persons, which within Catholicism grounds a person's right to religious freedom as a civil right. Mr. Barr's disfigured theology of grace also causes him to undermine within his analysis of religious freedom Catholicism's commitment to faith and reason, and as applied to the law, Catholicism's commitment to reason, evidence, and science. This is extremely problematic because based on his remarks, this appears to cause Mr. Barr to view his role as Attorney General to be one of empowering certain religious institutions over the religious freedom and conscience of all Americans, whether religious or non-religious. Additionally, it appears to explain why Mr. Barr feels licensed to dismiss certain outcomes of the rule of law, such as, for example, marriage equality, which is the result of reason, evidence, and science applied within the courts throughout this nation. This disregard for the outcomes and commitments of the rule of law by the sitting Attorney General should concern all of us. And frankly, this is why I am speaking with you today. In sum, at its core, Mr. Barr's assessment of what it means to be human is, in my assessment, detached from the theological anthropology of Catholicism, which he claims to profess, as well as the political theoretical roots of this nation in the Enlightenment. My critique in response is threefold. First, I will attempt to correct what Mr. Barr said about this nation's jurisprudential foundings. Second, I will explain why I have titled today's remarks Contempt of Grace, which really is the heart of my theological critique of Attorney General Barr's understanding of religious freedom, and my reframing of religious freedom from a Catholic perspective. And third, I will explain why what Attorney General Barr said must matter to all of us who love this country and the rule of law on which it depends. So to begin, my correction of Mr. Barr's understanding of the jurisprudential foundings of this nation. Law, theology, and politics each reflect a certain understanding of what it means to be human. Mr. Barr claims that, quote, by and large, the founding generation's view of human nature was drawn from the classical Christian tradition, close quote. This is not correct, or at best a profound overstatement. The framers of the Constitution believed that human beings possess natural rights. And as Professor Richard McBrien observes in his book, Caesar's Coin, Religion and Politics in America, quote, there is a blending of ideas and traditions in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers. The Declaration of Independence grounds human and political rights in natural and divine law alike, the laws of nature and nature's God. But some of the particulars are not out of the classical tradition. There is also a fundamental distrust of every kind of authority, including religious. Each person must be free, even free to be wrong. Freedom more than order is vulnerable to assault, and vigilance is its price, close quote. Some years back, a former faculty member of Notre Dame's law school, John Coughlin, wrote a thought-provoking piece, I thought, entitled Law and Theology, Reflections on What It Means to Be Human from a Franciscan Perspective. In it, Coughlin offers a rather succinct but by no means exhaustive summation of the liberal theory in anthropology informing jurisprudence. Coughlin writes, and I quote, every system of law reflects certain foundational assumptions about what it means to be human. The concept of justice operative in the legal culture of the modern liberal state, for example, tends to manifest the anthropological assumptions of the classical liberal political theory. Hobbes and Locke viewed the human person as a radically autonomous individual who consented to leave the freedom of the state of nature and to enter the social contract in order to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. This fundamental anthropological assumption has produced a great deal of individual freedom that remains characteristic of the modern democratic society. When understood in the proper perspective, autonomy and the correlative suspicion of government's power are important goals, close quote. Accordingly, Mr. Barr's claims regarding the jurisprudential foundings of this nation are historically inaccurate, and it is important to know this. Significantly, Attorney General Barr completely ignores the jurisprudential roots of this nation in the Enlightenment. I believe it is appropriate to question if this historical omission by Attorney General is intentional and informed by his commitment to a particular interpretation of Roman Catholicism, which places an extreme emphasis on the authority of the papacy and institutional patriarchal church, rather than the authority of the individual person and their own conscience regarding matters of faith and law, which church teaching, I would add, would require in the 21st century after Vatican II. In this regard, Mr. Barr's interpretation of Catholicism and his institutional fideism are, in my judgment, not in the mainstream of Catholicism, any more than Vice President Pence's extreme biblical fundamentalism would be considered mainstream within mainline Protestant Christianity. I would add that I am also mindful of Mr. Barr's service on the board of directors of Opus Dei. Opus Dei is a secretive, ultra-conservative organization informed by an ecclesiology in stark contrast with the ecclesiology of Vatican II. I will return to my claim that Mr. Barr's dismissal of the roots of this nation in the Enlightenment may be intentional in a moment. Attorney General Barr also claims, in further disregard of history, that, quote, the founding generations were Christians. They believed that the Judeo-Christian moral system corresponds to the true nature of man, close quote. In response, I will simply echo what Michael Sean Winters recently wrote about Attorney General Barr's sweeping claim that the founders were Christian. Quote, it is true that Christian and moral sensibilities were in the air the founders breathed, but it is also true that the nation's first 3 presidents were not Orthodox Christians, but deists. And Mr. Barr, there is no such thing as a Judeo-Christian tradition. There are Jewish traditions and Christian traditions. The concept of a Judeo-Christian tradition is a 20th century fiction created for political purposes, close quote. So in my opinion, we see these political purposes currently being acted out aggressively by the Trump administration and its agents, including, by way of example, William Barr, Vice President Mike Pence, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and others. Hence, the Attorney General's language in his speech when he speaks of those in this nation who do not subscribe to his Judeo-Christian moral system as, quote, militant secularists and so-called progressives. He proudly asserts, and this is important given the office that he holds. Think about this. He proudly asserted in his speech that as Attorney General, and I am quoting, we have set up a task force within the department with different components that have equities in this area, including the Solicitor General's office, the Civil Division, the Office of Legal Counsel, and other offices. We have regular meetings. We keep an eye out for cases or events around the country where states are misapplying the Establishment Clause in a way that discriminates against people of faith. Of course, what Mr. Barr means is this force, and I do use the word coercive force of the law, is being implemented to protect and further his brand of Judeo-Christian institutions, not people of all faiths, Muslims and other religious minorities, or atheists, which the Establishment Clause also protect. In fact, in his speech about religious freedom, Mr. Barr's only reference to the Establishment Clause is how it is purportedly being used by states to limit religious freedom. He says nothing about he as Attorney General, how he as Attorney General will defend and further the Establishment Clause as a protection of religious minorities and non-believers against the tyranny of an established religion. Significantly, on the same day that Attorney General gave his speech here at the law school, and it was posted on the Department of Justice website, I would add, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, an evangelical Christian, delivered a speech to the American Association of Christian Counselors in Nashville entitled, Being a Christian Leader, which was also promoted on the State Department's homepage. So, What is the political purpose here? Why is Attorney General Barr rewriting history, imposing a Judeo-Christian construct over the foundings of this nation in the Enlightenment? The answer? First, I believe it is because the Enlightenment and our constitutional republic, which is rooted in Enlightenment political theory, entail a fundamental commitment to the dignity of all persons and their inherent goodness and equality before the law, with which Mr. Barr does not agree. In particular, if such persons are sexual minorities, religious minorities, or women exercising their moral consciences and asserting their right to liberty against the coercive power of the state or patriarchal religious institutions. Second, because also essential to the Enlightenment and this nation's founding in classical liberal political theory is a commitment to individual autonomy and freedom and a distrust of every kind of extrinsic authority, including religious authority. This hermeneutics of autonomy and suspicion is inconsistent with William Barr's preoccupation with what he terms, quote, individual rapacity, and Mr. Barr's pursuit of what he calls, quote, an effective restraint of licentiousness, the unbridled pursuit of personal appetites at the expense of the common good. In a nutshell, instead of a legal order based on reason, evidence, and science, i.e., the actual building blocks of our rule of law in a pluralistic democracy, applicable to all persons of inherent dignity, equal before the law, regardless of religious or non-religious identity, Attorney General Barr is promoting a coercive relationship between church and state, which in fact was not the framers' view, but which Mr. Barr claims was when he asserts that, quote, in the framers' view, free government was only suitable and sustainable for a religious people. This is our Attorney General saying this. In the framers' view, free government was only suitable and sustainable for a religious people, a people who recognized that there was a transcendent moral order, i.e., Mr. Barr's version of natural law, antecedent to both the state and man-made laws, and who had the discipline to control themselves according to these enduring principles, end quote. My goodness, if this is not a father knows best obliteration of this nation's core commitment to the primacy of human freedom and unity and diversity through reason and evidence and science, I do not know what is. But in fact, it is much worse than this. And I'll explain why as I turn now to why I entitled this response to Attorney General Barr, Contempt of Grace. So this is my analysis of the theological error in William Barr's understanding of religious freedom, since he spoke here as a Catholic, and this is a Catholic law school. So I want to say a few words about Catholicism, not because I presume all gathered here are Catholic or of any faith at all, but because Mr. Barr misrepresented Catholic anthropology in his remarks, and as an attorney who is theologically trained, I need to correct the record. Earlier in my remarks, I defined grace as the work and presence of God in creation. William Barr's fundamental theological error from a Catholic perspective is that he situates grace, now remember that's the work and presence of God in creation. He situates grace not in the lives of all persons in all their glorious diversity, but only in those who share his own Judeo-Christian interpretive construct, or at least only in those whose lives comport with his moral construct. Hence, rather than understanding law itself as rooted in our communion with God and others, oriented toward a good common to all, Barr views religion, translate this, Mr. Barr's Judeo-Christian construct, as necessary, quote, to promote the moral discipline and virtue needed to support free government, close quote. According to Attorney General Barr, quote, Judeo-Christian moral standards, and this is an important point he makes. It tells you a lot about his theological paradigm. According to Attorney General Barr, quote, Judeo-Christian moral standards are the ultimate utilitarian rules for human conduct. They reflect the rules that are best for man, not in the by and by, but in the here and now. They are like God's instruction manual for the best running of man and human society, close quote. According to Barr, these are the rules that are necessary to combat secularism and moral relativism. Besides being extremely presumptuous and offensive to persons of other religions, atheists, humanists, and Catholics who have not rejected the dogma of the Second Vatican Council and the extraordinary theological renewal since then, Attorney General Barr's comments should frighten anyone who cherishes the Establishment Clause as well as the Free Exercise Clause of our Constitution. Theologically speaking, however, operative in Mr. Barr's remarks regarding religious freedom is a puny theology of grace that is devoid of any genuine understanding of the actual moral lives and goodness of persons different than himself, particularly women, religious minorities, and LGBTQ citizens. As a practitioner of the law, I suspect Mr. Barr has never had the privilege of serving such good people as counselor, advocate, and officer of the court. From a Catholic perspective, what Mr. Barr is doing is replacing who God has revealed God's self to be in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, a God whose mystery is a capacity for compassion and communion, with a coercive religious construct he labels Judeo-Christian. However, the life of faith which our Constitution protects is not, as Barr contends, quote, the ultimate utilitarian rule of human conduct, the purpose of which is coercively to guardrail against the licentious appetites of humanity, but rather, the life of faith is recognition of the gift of participation in the life and being of God and one another in God. From this perspective, when we promote public policies and law consistent with who God has shown God's self to be in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that is essentially relational and one in whom justice and love are one, we participate in God's very self in the economy of salvation. In Greek, this is oikonomia, the law of the household. So a genuine Catholic theology of grace sees God's present everywhere, working through creation toward the fulfillment of all in God. And it is from this perspective that Catholics understand law and politics to be theologically relevant. Further, given Catholicism's principles of communion, mediation, and sacramentality, the understanding of the human person informing law and politics must itself be informed by the actual practice of the law and the actual lives of women, men, and indeed all persons in all their rich diversity, if the law is genuinely to promote a good common to all. Given this reality, Mr. Barr's claim that, quote, Christianity teaches a micro-morality, end quote, and that, quote, we transform the world by focusing on our own personal morality and transformation is wrong and inconsistent with the law of the household, economy of salvation, which is inherently relational and consequential to all persons and indeed to all creation. With disdain, Mr. Barr notes, quote, the new secular religion teaches macro-morality. One's morality is not gauged by their private conduct, but rather on their commitment to political causes and collective action to address social problems. Close quote. Well, actually, within Catholicism, the moral life is also essentially relational, and by the way, so is the law. Law, therefore, and indeed all persons' lives, if they are to mediate and furthers God's law of the household, must be based in a communion amongst persons such that justice and love are one. Within Catholic Christianity, the doctrine of God is central to our theological anthropology. And from a Trinitarian perspective, one cannot disregard God's self-disclosure in Jesus of Nazareth and say anything meaningful about God. Therefore, from a Catholic theological perspective, we concretely see what justice looks like in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, by whom coercive power was eschewed. There is no outcast or unclean person. The stranger is welcomed. The hungry are fed. The thirsty are given drink. The naked are clothed and the sick are cared for. The imprisoned are not abandoned. Again, notice, and this is important, because Mr. Barr has a preoccupation. Jesus of Nazareth, for Christians, the Christ, God incarnate for Christians, unlike William Barr, who is quite preoccupied by the subject, said almost nothing about sex. And he certainly did not define himself in terms of it. He also did not define himself against others. He exercised no coercion toward women or anyone else. He did, however, welcome the stranger, fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, and clothed the naked. And he cured and cared for the sick and did not abandon the imprisoned. In short, Mr. Barr's dismissal of the essentially relational reality of God, which is what the doctrine of the Trinity is all about, and the relational consequence for all persons who are made in the image and likeness of God, is nothing short, from a Catholic perspective, contemptuous. His views are in contempt of grace, the oikonomia, the law of the household. What I am suggesting is that Mr. Barr fundamentally misapprehends the Christian moral life. I recommend that Mr. Barr read the social teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, including its relevant encyclicals and the documents of Vatican II, especially the Declaration on Religious Liberty, in which the Church recognizes religious freedom as a right deriving from the dignity of the human person, not religious affiliation. I also recommend that Mr. Barr take a lesson from the life and writings of Martin Luther King Jr., who was actually theologically accomplished, having received his doctorate in theology from Boston University. As a Christian, Dr. King understood that justice is, in fact, constitutive of the gospel. In other words, justice is essential for those who follow Jesus Christ. The understanding of human dignity informing Dr. King's pursuit of racial justice, his efforts to eliminate poverty, and his witness to peace was an awe-inspiring appreciation that we all are only fully human when we are persons of compassion for whom justice and love are one. The brilliance, the absolute brilliance of Dr. King, in contrast to the Judeo-Christian construct Mr. Barr offers, is the enlightened and liberating integration of Dr. King's faith into his politics, not the distortion of politics and the law by a presumptive and oppressive faith. These matters are serious, particularly because of the office and powers Mr. Barr holds as the chief law enforcement officer of this nation. I will explain now how serious from the perspective of the law. And I appreciate that you hung in there with me through that, because there was a lot to unpack based on the fact that Attorney General Barr spoke as though he were representing the Catholic faith. And I think it's important to understand that there are those of us within that tradition who believe that his presentation was grievously in error, theologically speaking. The legal errors of his understanding of religious freedom. First, a significant error in Mr. Barr's understanding of religious freedom and his duty to protect it as Attorney General is that, again, what he really seeks to defend is his Judeo-Christian natural law construct, not the religious freedom of all individuals, particularly religious minorities, sexual minorities, and women. In fact, Attorney General Barr goes so far as to blame what he labels an increasing social pathology on secularism and moral relativism, without providing, and this is important, this is the Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer, and he labels social pathology, He blames it on secularism and moral relativism without providing any evidentiary basis for making such a claim regarding causation. Mr. Barr also criticizes the supposed moral relativism of the society and the development of the law. Very significantly and not accidentally, the types of cases which caused William Barr to decry the supposed moral relativism of American law are cases involving human sexuality, and particularly women's reproductive sexual lives or the experience of sexual minorities such as LGBTQ citizens. Significantly, Mr. Barr gives no attention, none, to how the law through its power might restrict and eliminate poverty, particularly as it impacts the lives of poor women and children, or how the law might attack this nation's dominant, too often predatory culture of physical and sexual violence against women and children. Also, as Michael Winters aptly notes, and I quote, Barr attributes increases in social pathology to secularism and moral relativism, as if the emergence of a full-blown commercial culture accompanied by spread eagle capitalism had nothing to do with the emergence of social pathologies, close quote. What I am suggesting is that the patriarchal religious extremism we are experiencing in law and the body politic today, Mr. Barr's views included, are based not only on an ill-informed theology, but also legal constructs which are often privileged and male, having nothing to do with the real lives of the persons on whom such constructs are projected. As practitioners of the law, or those of us who are in training to be practitioners of the law, this should disturb all of us. This is also why I believe that academic legal theorists' preoccupation with the radical individualism of the law is misplaced. Rather, it is the relational reality of the law to which attention should be given in order to promote justice. Law is not too individualistic. Rather, it is the power in the relationships which is problematic, and it is only through attention to the actual persons in relationship in all their diverse particularity that laws may be ordered toward a good common to all. Second, from a legal perspective, while Mr. Barr worries himself with what he calls the, quote, licentiousness, the unbridled pursuit of personal appetites at the expense of the common good, personally, I am much more concerned about the religious licentiousness of Mr. Barr and others in the Trump administration. Instead of defending his Judeo-Christian construct under the auspices of the Free Exercise Clause and the problematic jurisprudence since the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, which in my view impermissibly favors the establishment of religion, Mr. Barr should be worried about what Professor Marcy Hamilton has described as, quote, the voracious side of religious guarantees, religious entities having the capacity for great good and great evil, and society is not duty-bound by any constitutional principle to let them avoid duly enacted laws, especially when their actions harm others. To say that religious liberty must encompass the right to harm others is to radicalize the First Amendment. The framers did not intend to create extreme religious liberty, to turn the US into a collection of mini theocracies, or to give believers the power to impose their belief on others. They instead assumed acts harming safety and public welfare and licentious acts would be illegal for everyone. As Professor Hamilton explains, the examples of religion causing harm to others are legion. Sometimes the fight goes on for centuries, as it did in Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, and Iraq between Muslim sects, and in Egypt between Muslims and Christians. Christians led the horror-filled years of the medieval Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition. Britain's Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth executed or exiled scores of, quote, infidels who did not profess the Queen's religion. In the United States, the Salem witches were hung, or in one man's case, crushed to death for religious reasons. In this era, Islamic radicals, many of whom are part of a fundamentalist movement that was initiated in 1928, are waging a war of terror worldwide, as New York and Boston know all too well. To this day, in this country, there are male fundamentalist polygamists in secret enclaves who enslave women, sexually and physically abuse their girls, and abandon their teenage boys. Faith-healing parents stand by as children die agonizing deaths from easily treated diseases. Clergy in many denominations, including Roman Catholic priests, have sexually abused thousands upon thousands of children. To the extent the United States has sublimated the potential risks of religious entities, it has sold out its most vulnerable. Close quote. From the perspective of the law, therefore, Mr. Barr should be combating, and this is my contention, Mr. Barr should be combating the religious licentiousness that now threatens our pluralistic democracy. I would propose a corrective to current First Amendment jurisprudence. One, repeal the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, which imposes a new super strict scrutiny framework on neutral and generally applicable laws. And I would join Professor Marcy Hamilton and, quote, endorse the Supreme Court's unfairly maligned opinion in Employment Division versus Smith, since there is no constitutional right to harm others simply because the conduct is religiously motivated. The court's First Amendment doctrine, as Marcy says, is wise. Again, Professor Hamilton argues, the right balance is achieved by subjecting believers to the rule of law that applies to everyone else, unless they can prove that an exemption will not significantly harm others. In a word, harm to others, particularly minorities and the vulnerable, based on your religious freedom is un-American, and it is not Catholic. Third and finally, given my clear commitment to the very positive understanding of persons entailed in Catholicism's theological anthropology and theology of grace, and my additional commitment to the positive Enlightenment anthropology, which grounds American law, I would not want you to think for a moment that I do not believe in humanity's capacity for evil. In this respect, I agree with Mr. Barr's assessment that, quote, men, he says men, not I, are subject to passions and appetites, and if unrestrained, are capable of ruthlessly running roughshod over their neighbors and the community at large, close quote. Where Mr. Barr and I differ is that I recognize that some of the worst atrocities in history have been furthered through unholy alliances of church and state. A case in point of which we need to be acutely aware, as Donald Trump uses the extreme religious right, as Putin uses the Orthodox Church in Russia to foster their shared authoritarian and oligarchian worldview, is how successfully Salazar in Portugal, Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, and Hitler in Germany used the Roman Catholic Church for their fascist purposes by appealing to the Galatian diarchy, the teaching that the world should be ruled by the union of state and church. In his remarks on religious freedom, although he sees church and state as distinct, Mr. Barr also has an understanding of, quote, natural law, which in my assessment comports much more with the theology of grace, which existed in the Roman Church immediately prior to the rise of fascism, than one that is informed by the theology of grace operative in the dogmatic teachings of the Church's Second Ecumenical Council, especially Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae, as well as Catholic social teaching, for example, Pacem in Terris. These teachings espouse the inherent dignity and moral authority of all individuals, regardless of religious affiliation. So to conclude, Catholic anthropology is consistent with the founding of our nation in the Enlightenment, because both entail reverence for the dignity and moral authority of individual persons, regardless of their religious affiliation. In contrast to Attorney General Barr, my hope for our nation does not rest in the coercive imposition of a religious construct on the civil religious liberties of persons of difference, nor is my hope found in the micro-morality he espouses. Instead, my own hope remains in the work and presence of God, grace, in a truly free nation where all persons, religious and non-religious alike, may realize their full humanity through laws and public policy based in the common good, not a narrow religious paradigm which our Constitution and its Establishment Clause protect against. Thank you. So Allison, did we